Everyone, my name is Josh and this is WHIMS Cool and Interesting Musings, and today I'm going to be talking about Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 and the first Hellraiser film. So Hellraiser came from the imagination of Clive Barker, who was a philosopher and playwright and artist who came from the UK. He came from a theatre background. That's how he met Doug Bradley, and he wrote plays for the small little theatre group that he was a part of. And he basically was a philosopher as well, so there was a lot of emphasis on those things. But he came up with the idea of Hellraiser from his own short story or short novel called The Hellbound Heart, and he basically wanted to direct it like he was directing a classic Hammer horror film or a Universal Studios monster film, where the entirety of the story was based around his more gothic atmosphere and mood. And what is at the heart of Hellraiser is it is a story about sexual repression. This theme kind of manifests itself in the character of Julia. She comes into the Cotton family as a woman who is unhappily married. She loves Larry, who is the person she's married to, but she feels like she has, as soon as she sees a photograph of Frank, his older brother, she begins to really, feel a sense of nostalgia because she had an affair with him. She had this wild, crazy affair with him, and she feels bored and she feels unhappy. She's got a little bit of perspective now where she feels like Larry is boring, he's dull, he's very stable, and she wants wild, crazy, spontaneous adventure, in a manner of speaking. So she decides to basically, just go along with it until something else comes along. But everything changes when Larry cuts himself on a rusty nail, and this gives birth to Frank, who has, before he just sort of manifests himself as a skinless husk of a human being, he disappeared. He vanished after he solved a box called the Lament Configuration, or La Marchance box. And it's this mechanism where it's kind of like a Rubik's cube, kind of not, where if you solve its mechanisms, you basically open a doorway into another world where you are basically tortured for pain and pleasure, and you are doing this for a whole of eternity. It's basically a hellish punishment, and you are basically at the mercy of these creatures called Cenobites, and they're referred to as follows: Pinhead, Deep Throat, aka female Cenobite, even though I'm going to be calling her Deep Throat because I don't think that character should be defined by her gender, so I'm calling her Deep Throat, Butterball, and Chatterer. These are all characters which I'm going to be talking about when we get to the sequel, but these are the characters that are first established. And they're meant to be, they're not necessarily villains. They're not like, Freddy Krueger or Chucky or Freddy or Jason, where they just basically want to kill you. They have a job to do, and their job is to get souls that the Leviathan gives them so that they can, basically indulge in sex, violence, and all sorts of sadomasochism. And they got that in Frank, but Frank somehow escaped them after Larry bled all over the floorboards of the attic. So when Julia is... And there's a great emphasis of how much their marriage is in decline when they have this dinner party, and she kisses all the men on the lips, but she doesn't, and she hugs all the women, but she doesn't give Larry any kind of affection whatsoever. She just basically gives him a look, and she just says, "Good night," and then they just she goes off up to her room, and this is where she encounters Frank, who she's terrified of at first, but then when she finds out that, he needs souls to give back skin, she very slowly starts to get comfortable with a scenario where she goes out, meets these strange men, and she kills them, only for Frank to take their skin. So she very slowly starts to go into this downward spiral of insanity, where she just basically is very slowly starting to dust off the act of killing someone or washing blood off of her hands, and she just doesn't care. She doesn't care because she wants to have sex with Frank. She doesn't care about love. She doesn't care about affection. She just wants wild and crazy sex. That's all she wants. And she's going to get that wild and crazy sex as soon as the skin is back on him. But who's going to be the one to be the candidate to be his new skin? Well, that's going to be revealed later, because Kirsty, after having a pep talk with her father during dinner, she decides to talk to Julia, like, just the two of them have a conversation, but she finds that she is inviting a strange man into their house, and she follows them. This is where she encounters Frank for the very first time in ages. And to me, I think there's something very sinister between the relationship between Kirsty and her Uncle Frank, because she says the words upon meeting him, "Don't touch me," which is a very bizarre thing to say to your uncle. It could be that he is just all covered with it. He's just basically hasn't got skin. He's basically a bloody husk, and she just doesn't want to be touched because she doesn't want to get the gore or anything on her. But part of me feels in some way that there's something much more sinister between their relationship, and it's even confirmed in the sequel in some way, and it makes it even more creepier. I'm just sorry, but yeah, I hate Frank in this film. He's a really horrible person. But yeah, I think the way she handles him, though, in this scene is really wonderful. When she grabs the box, she has this moment where he goes, "Give it to me," and then she's just like, "No," and then she just says, "You want it? Fucking have it," and then she just throws it out the window. And I think Kirsty is a fantastic character. Like, the way she just bites back and she has this, drive to just survive. She basically is the quintessential final girl main protagonist. And I love the emphasis on feminism. So there's sexual repression with the character of Julia, and of course in some cases Frank, and of course the fact that both this love triangle is meant to be sort of like a symbolic representation of the two sides of sexual repression. You have squeaky clean, very stable, very polite Larry. You have Julia, you have Frank, who's the sadist, who basically would swear in a church if he was given the permission to, or if he just kind of just didn't care. He'd quite happily swear in church if he wanted to. He's that kind of character. He just doesn't care. He's a sadist. He's explored everything that needs to be explored in all sorts of ways. So he doesn't care about what happens to his soul. He just cares about, just cruising through life, essentially. So he's not a very nice person. He's very cruel. He's very open. He's very open. He's very, he's very much pure evil, essentially. And he's not a very nice person. He's pure evil. But he's basically the other side of that, which is that he's very liberated. He's very free. He doesn't care what people think. And then you have Julia in the middle, who basically is being pulled from pillar to post by these two men. But what's very interesting is that Larry pretty much is trying his best to make it work. But the problem is that Frank is very insistent. But then you have the feminist angle from the point of view of Julia essentially being our twisted protagonist. She essentially, for the first half of the film, she's the one who's getting these kills, these bodies, for Frank to consume so that he can become human again. And we're very slowly seeing her slowly go from this very polite, very kind of, this very ideal match for Larry, but in many ways she starts to very slowly peel back the layers, and she realizes that there's a darkness inside her as she's starting to humour Frank more, humour his desires, humour his emotions and what he wants. And that's basically a very interesting angle to talk about from a feminist perspective. That sort of her being liberated was her having her affair with Frank. Whereas Kirsty, she has a much more interesting arc where she's basically the personification of innocence. She works at a pet store. She basically has reactions like when she has her first boyfriend, essentially, she kind of treats it as though, oh, it's very innocent, it's very polite, like she teases him, and she has, these very mocking glares, like she even mocks his accent by saying things like, "There you go again, I beg your pardon," kind of thing. Like, she constantly mocks him, but she's also a character that really cares for things. She cares for her father, obviously, but she also cares for animals as well. She works at a pet shop in the city as well, so there's a lot of emphasis that she is basically the personification of innocence. And when the Cenobites come into her life, it's like, oh, she's now starting to see that the world's a lot more sinister and a lot more demented and tempting as the Cenobites are. And their entrance in this entire film is absolutely fantastic, because there's a nurse watching TV in the background and you can see a flower blooming which is meant to be, you know, symbolic of a woman, you know, essentially going through puberty. That's meant to be, you know, a woman's sexual awakening, essentially. So that's a very interesting idea, and the way they're introduced is her basically biting the apple. The box is essentially meant to be the classical story of Adam and Eve, or Eve being tempted by the apple and her eating it, essentially, or her opening the box or entertaining the idea of opening the box is meant to be her being tempted into, you know, sin, essentially, or doing sinful acts. And what the Cenobites are essentially doing is they're basically dragging her to hell so that they can participate in sadomasochistic torture, pain and pleasure, and all those kinds of things. And most of those acts are probably sexual as well as sadistic. So there's a lot of taboo topics being broached there. But what I really think is impressive is that they don't really see it as a seedy, horrible thing. It's their duty to do this. This is their duty, and Pinhead is essentially a priest who wants to convert people to his religion. Like, he even says at one point towards the end, "We have such sights to show you," as if to say, oh, come join us. Like, we're a part of this cult. We're a part of this, you know, syndicate of people who are very much, you know, in league with the idea of, you know, wanting to convert you to our religion. Please come to us. Come to us. We'll happily, you know, accept you and things like that. And Kirsty encounters the Cenobites. She finds out about Frank, that he escaped them, and she makes a deal with them to essentially take him instead of her. But when she gets back to the house, she finds that Frank has killed Larry and taken his skin, and that's when she starts to get upset and she starts to cry. But then there's that really wonderful scene where she's crying, but then she has this moment where she gets to bite back at him, and he goes, "Oh, don't worry about him. He was dead long before we touched him." And she just goes through gritted teeth, "You bastard!" And I'm like, yes, dig into him as much as you can, Kirsty, because he's an arsehole. But then he goes, "Hush now. It's all right. Your Frank's here. Your dear old Uncle Frank." And then the music box motif happens where the lights go down and there starts to emerge shadow, but then there's lights streaming in through the openings in the walls. And then Pinhead shows up, and then Chatterer does this moment where he shows up and he does his little chattering sound, and there's a close-up of his teeth, but then he just nudges Frank as if to say, "What are you going to do, Frank, huh?" I love that moment where he just shoves him. And it's so satisfying because the Cenobites, even though they do look horrible and they do look grotesque, we're not afraid of them. We're not afraid of them in the same way that we're afraid of someone like Frank. It's like with Stephen King's stories. Like, you're not frightened of the monsters in the mist. You're frightened of Mrs. Carmody and her followers. You're not frightened of Carrie, nor are you frightened of anybody else. You're not frightened of anything supernatural. You're frightened of the bullies, and you're frightened of the mother, Margaret White. You're not frightened about the monsters. You're frightened about the people. And that's essentially what Hellraiser does. It basically gives you that humanoid allegory of the humans are the monsters. They're the real evil in the world. The monsters are just there as a part of the furniture, essentially. And the Cenobites do their job. They take him back to hell, and Larry, aka Frank, says the most deliciously evil line, which is, "Jesus wept." And he gives a little lick of his lips afterwards, as if to say, "Yeah, I'm going to hell, but I'm going to really make sure that you are absolutely disgusted with me before I go." And it really is horrific. But I really like the fact that the actor who played Larry, who's meant to be playing Frank in that scene, he was meant to say the words "fuck you," but then he just decided to make it even more sinister and much more blasphemous, because that's something that Frank would do. He doesn't care about what happens to his soul. He's completely content with being an amoral, sadistic, sadomasochistic piece of shit. He doesn't care. So the fact that he kind of goes out blaspheming really goes to show that he really doesn't care, and that's the final nail in the coffin for Uncle Frank. And it's a fantastic moment because it really shows you how bloody and how grotesque it can be. So with Frank gone, you think all of Kirsty's troubles are over, but oh no, Pinhead shows up and he says, oh, we have such sights to show you. We're still going to take you down to hell, though. Like, thank you for giving us back our soul, but we still have an agreement of, oh, we need to, take you back to hell with us. But then she decides to solve the box, and all the Cenobites in equal succession decide to go back to the Cenobite realm. And following this, she gets escorted to the Channard Institute, where she runs into Kyle and Dr. Channard, who is basically a neurosurgeon who runs his own institute, and he basically is trying to discover the intricacies of the human mind. And he even compares the human brain to a labyrinth with many doorways, many entryways, and you just need to get to its centre to really get to the bottom of what the human mind can experience. And he essentially is like Frank, but just of a different variety. It's a very similar flavour to Frank in the sense that he essentially is what a doctor would be like if you were too afraid to see a doctor. And that's essentially who Dr. Channard is. He's a sadistic son of a bitch who wears a snappy and very sophisticated suit, and he even has a British accent to really kind of bring this home. He's a horrible person. He believes that, human beings are meant to be dissected and treated like animals as opposed to actual human beings. He treats the mentally ill of his institute like they are animals. He has a subsection of his basement, which is basically one dilapidated looking asylum, and he doesn't really treat people with much respect. He even takes one of his patients home to basically use as a guinea pig after he finds out that the mattress in the old cotton house has the remains of a soul that was taken to the Cenobite realm. And this is where he releases Julia, who he then proceeds to do a little bit of a remix of the first film, where he starts to bring her victims to indulge in for her to, turn back into her human form. And I love the fact that she goes from this very bloodied husk who can feel that she's walking around without skin to essentially going to have this very wavy ginger hair, but then she also has these very well manicured nails as well, and this very flowing dress as well. Like she really has been glammed up since getting her skin back. But yeah, I love that moment where she just sort of, the bandages come off and then the hair flows in the wind and she's got well manicured nails. Love it. I do apologise, that was my niece. Yeah, she's just getting a little tired. But yeah, I love this film. This is probably my favourite horror sequel of all time. I think it's one of my favourites. I really do think that this particular sequel does a lot of good things right. It does a little bit of the things that a lot of sequels should do. It gives you a little bit of a setup of a unique and interesting idea. It's a continuation of the first film within the first 5 minutes, but then there's also a little bit of a remix going on, because when we encounter the opening scene, we see that another person is solving the box, but then it's no one that we've met really. It's just some random guy who looks like he's a soldier. He looks like he's captain in the First World War. And then we later find out that this is in fact Pinhead. In the very same flashback, which is the opening scene, it kind of does a recap of the first film, but then it shows you this opening sequence where it's like, oh, we see another person solve the box. In my opinion, this is going to be a little bit of a critique of the film. I would have actually cut this scene out or removed this scene and put it somewhere else, because I feel like having it be the opening scene is a little weird, because I feel like it's basically a rehash of the torture scene where the hooks go into Frank at the very beginning. So I'd have actually removed this scene and saved the scene for when Kirsty is in Channard's house and she's looking through the scrapbook of all the things that Channard has accumulated in regards to the lament configuration. And he clearly knows of the box's existence, and he knows what it's going to do and what it's capable of, because he has tons of other versions of the lament configuration in glass domes. But not only this, but he has tons of other newspaper clippings about children of the vortex, puberty linked to psychic phenomena, and various other things. So there's a lot of emphasis on him looking at children as being the gateway, or people with special abilities as a gateway to this particular new world. So he decides to introduce a character called Tiffany, who hasn't been able to speak. She's she was brought to the Channard Institute because she was a mute. She'd gone through a very traumatic experience and she hasn't been able to speak. But she does have a fascination with puzzles and solving puzzles. So she gives Tiffany this particular puzzle box, and she solves it, and that's when the Cenobites are reintroduced to the story, where there's the wonderful Christopher Young score, and I really do think that this particular score is fantastic. It's up there with some of the best of John Williams or Danny Elfman or Alan Silvestri, and all these other great classical composers. To me, in terms of what they're able to do, Thomas Newman, Hans Zimmer, there's so many great composers, but I think Christopher Young should be up there with the best of them. His work on these two films alone are worthy of recognition and respect, because he really does have this very unique flavour to his music that really gives you this new sense of, mystery and intrigue. But this film is just fantastic. There's a lot of great, wonderful quotes in this film. There's a lot of wonderful one-liners. Like, I love Julia's one-liners in this film. I love the scene where she goes to... She finds out... Julia goes up to the attic room and she sees all the dead bodies hung up on hooks. And she turns around when the door closes and she sees that Julia is standing there. And she goes, "Kirsty, you have a surprisingly good taste in men. You see, Kirsty, they changed the rules of the fairy tale. I'm not just the wicked stepmother anymore. I'm also the evil queen. So come on, take your best shot, Snow White." And then Kirsty gets angry, and then she rushes to her, and then Julia just gives her this slap, and then she just knocks her out cold. That's such a great scene. I love it. It's one of Julia's best moments, I think. It's one of the most quotable moments for me, because Julia is such a bitch in this film, but she really does, show that she is just pure, unadulterated evil. She is really just evil, and she's just a fabulous character. She really is. She's one of my favourite characters that everyone hates, but I like for a reason. Like, she's up there with Ratched, Hannibal Lecter, Homelander, and Art the Clown for me in terms of really horrible people that I just love. So yeah, I think she's a great character, but she is totally evil. She's a total bitch, but I absolutely think Julia's a great character. But yeah, this entire film is fantastic. It goes bigger. We literally go to hell in this film, and I think that's really wonderful. I love the fact that it's very playful. I like the fact that there's a lot of great art design. I love the fact that it literally looks like a giant... The corridors of this hellbound labyrinth is essentially a giant lament configuration. I like the fact that Leviathan is basically a wonderful manifestation of the lament configuration. I like the fact that Leviathan has a method for turning people into Cenobites. Sometimes he'll basically just find you through the lament configuration, like with Pinhead, as we later find out through backstory that, Pinhead was once human. He was Captain Elliot Spencer, and he found the lament configuration, and he was able to solve the box and get dragged to hell, essentially. But this film is a really good example of how you do a sequel and how you make it bigger. It's essentially the James Cameron philosophy of, let's take a sequel, let's make it bigger, let's make it more, fun, let's give it more, gore, give it more character development, and see where it takes us. But it really does do a very good job of making sure everything pays off. This entire film is a fantastic example of how to do a horror sequel right, and how to do it with all the same flavour of the original, but add a few things here and there, and I really do love that. I love the scene where Dr. Channard and Julia, big surprise, have actually indulged in a relationship, and there's this moment where they're going to the cliff of the labyrinth, and he sees Leviathan, and when he reacts to him, he sees flashes of his childhood where he's dissecting a animal, and that's basically a very stereotypical textbook example of a serial killer. So to me, I think this particular example shows that he's a sadist. He doesn't care about people. He cares more about human beings as test subjects, as something to be poked and prodded. A science project, basically. That's what human beings are to him. And when he reacts to this, Julia has this really wonderful speech where he goes, Why do you think I decided to come back? He wanted souls, and it chose you. Ooh, you wanted to see, you wanted to know. Well, now you know, and I'm free. Now everybody's happy. Goodbye, Doctor. And then the wire comes out, the piano wire, and it goes across his head, and I'm like, oh no, but I love it because she really shows that, yeah, she planned this the entire time, and it was just brilliant. It's such a great, speech that she gives, but I think it's really wonderful. She even says, when he goes, oh my God, and she goes, no, this is my God, the God I serve in this world and the next. Leviathan, Lord of the Labyrinth, and it's just so, it gives me chills every time whenever I hear that speech. Like, it's just such a good moment, because this character, he is essentially featured in all the Hellraiser comics. He's referenced a lot in a lot of the supplementary material, the action figures, the comics, and he literally is a character that has no real visage, except of course through shapes, through the lament configuration, through the various incarnations of the lament configuration. And it really is quite fascinating. So I really do love the lore of Hellraiser. I really do love how much detail Clive Barker and other writers have put into this particular universe. So this film is just fantastic. I don't want to go through any more because I really do want people to watch this film. As of this writing, it's on Sky Cinema, and I really do urge a lot of horror fans, even if you're not a huge fan of gore, I would recommend checking out this film, because it's just such a fascinating example of what horror is capable of, what it's capable of making you feel, what it's capable of making you, see and know. And I just think a good horror story should always make you feel like it's a part of you. It explores emotions and feelings that you can relate to and you can identify with. And this film does such a good job of doing that. And I think Clive Barker, if nothing else, he has absolutely created a masterclass in how to do very effective horror. So I absolutely love Hellbound and Hellraiser and Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And this has been basically my review for these first two films. Let me know what you think of these films. If you've seen them, let me know your thoughts about Hellbound and the first Hellraiser film in the comments. And if you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe. Hit the subscribe bell. And I hope you're all having a very good day. This has been Josh with Whimsical Industry Musings. Take care. Bye-bye for now.